Welcome to Module 3 of our course on accelerating the implementation of STISA, Africa's Science, Technology and Innovation Strategy 2024. Before I get into this module, I want to just to refresh, to go back to the modules that we've had already, which were focused on concepts, on theories of science, technology and innovation, on concepts of policy, the policy process, and definition of science, technology and innovation policy. We by now all understand what science, technology and innovation are all about. We appreciate they are interrelated, but each is in many ways distinct. We appreciate that their relationships are not linear, in the sense that innovation is not necessarily driven by technology, not necessarily driven by research or science. That the interrelationships of science, technology, and innovation are quite complex. We should also by now appreciate the importance of policy in governing science, technology, and innovation. In Module 2, we define what science, technology, and innovation is all about, and looked at the different facets of science policy, technology policy, and innovation policy, and emphasized that in fact science, technology, and innovation policy deals mainly with the promotion of science, research, technology development, innovation, which is about the introduction of new products, practices, processes, ways of doing things in general into economic space. We also talked of science for policy, which is the use of science evidence in policy making. In Module 3, what we want to cover are in general the role that science, technology, and innovation play in global and African development. We'll emphasize that over the past 5 decades or so, science, technology, and innovation have become very central to global and African development agendas. Just sorry that the word global is misplaced on my slide. But what I propose that we would cover in this module first are some reflections on what development is. Emphasizing that development is not progress, that development is not modernization. Secondly, talk about the notion of sustainable development, which has gained currency everywhere, almost at all levels of governance, from global to local levels. People talk of sustainable development, and there are many sustainable development plans at the global level. Within the UN, there is Agenda 2030 and related sustainable development goals. We'll introduce those and then briefly talk about the African Union's Agenda 2063, which is really a sustainable development agenda. Then end this module by looking at how science, technology, and innovation will contribute to or may contribute to sustainable development, with emphasis on, again, the role that policy plays in to steer science, technology, and innovation to attain sustainable development. So those are the 5 themes that we are going to cover in module 3. So what is development? We every day talk about development. It is a term that is currently used in all kinds of circles, policy circles, academic circles, political circles, in the public sphere generally. People talk of development. What is it? There are different definitions of development. Sometimes there's a tendency to equate development to economic growth. There is a tendency to equate development with modernization. And we want to emphasize that, in fact, development is neither economic growth nor modernization. It's not about the accumulation of capital. Development is not accumulation of financial capital. It's not about economic growth per se. It's not growth in gross domestic product. So let's just note this: that development is not economic growth. It's not about accumulation of capital, and one could even add capitals, different forms of capital, either physical capital, financial capital. It's not about that. The definition that I want to propose for us to adopt is that to treat development as expansion of social and economic opportunities, expansion of social and economic capabilities, freedoms from want, freedom from poverty, freedom from social exclusion, enlargement of political liberties, enjoyment of certain assets, such as good health, such as social capital. So development is more than economic growth. It cannot be reduced to accumulation of just economic assets or economic capital. It's also important to recognize that development is not about progress, in the sense that it does not move in a particular determined pathway towards some good. The fact that a country, when a country thinks of development, or globally when we think of development, we cannot predetermine development. It does not move in a particular pathway. It's full of uncertainty. It doesn't necessarily lead to enjoyment of various freedoms by all in society. And that's why, again, policy matters. You require development policy to guide all kinds of social, economic, and political activities to ensure that citizens, ensure that society as a whole benefits in various ways, benefits by free from poverty, from social exclusion, free from political oppression, free from environmental harm, enjoying all kinds of liberties. Therefore, policy is important, and one could talk of development policy. What is sustainable development? Just briefly, the notion of sustainable development has been around for some time, starting in the 60s, and more particularly in the 70s and 80s, when there were concerns that development pathways taken the world as a whole and certain countries is unsustainable. unsustainable in many ways, that the development was very exclusive. Majority of the world's population was living in poverty. Few are getting rich, many getting poorer, and still the situation today. That you have social exclusion, particularly of women and girls. That development tends to favor male or men in the population. Women and girls get excluded. That also development is not been sustainable because causing all kinds of ecological harm, environmental destruction, the loss of biological diversity, climate change, degradation of land, pollution of oceans, a range of environmental activities. And development as a whole has not been sustainable. So over the last 50 years or so, the international community and individual countries have been preoccupied with getting development to be more sustainable in various ways. We've had a number of key UN conferences. In 1972, we had the United Nations Conference on environment and development in Stockholm, commonly referred to in the literature as the Stockholm Conference, where again it was emphasized that development pathways that many countries had adopted or were embarked on are not sustainable, sustainable at all. They were causing environmental harm. They were socially exclusive, economically exclusive as well. So the first, at the global level, the first really landmark to get sustainable development on the agenda was 1972 at Stockholm. And that the Stockholm Conference led to a number of major initiatives. For example, the establishment of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, which is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. It also led to the creation of the World Commission on Environment and Development, which worked between 1972 and 1987 and released a popular report, very popular, called Our Common Future, which then really defined sustainable development. In 1992, as most of you may know, we had in Rio, in Brazil, another conference 20 years after the Stockholm Conference. That Rio Conference, which was on environment and development, led to what was called Agenda 21. And Agenda 21, which is still very useful, covers a wide range of development, sustainable development issues clustered around economic issues, with emphasis on economic inclusion, moving away from exclusive growth, social issues, empowerment of women, girls, people with disabilities, then environmental issues. Really set a number of agendas. It is at that Rio Conference that key environmental agreements, such as the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is now turned into the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and other conventions were adopted. And as we'll emphasize later, again, Agenda 21 And those conventions are largely about science, technology, and innovation. How do you direct science, technology, and innovation to achieve development? I've talked about the Brundtland Commission. If you get an opportunity to read Our Common Future, I think there is you can find free copies. Our Common Future defined sustainable development as that development that meets the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future ones to meet their own needs, so that generations today do not undermine opportunities of future generations to also meet their own need, that you don't destroy the environment, undermining opportunities for future generations, that you don't destroy, you don't create an equal economy that will undermine future generations. Then in 2015, and most of you know this, we had the United Nations General Assembly adopt Agenda 2030 with 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the international community subscribes to. Before this SDGs, we had the Millennium Development Goals, which were between 2000 and 2015, a number again of goals around sustainable development. Let me now make some statements on the role of technology in sustainable development by essentially looking at the history. Until very recently, actually until just about 60 years ago, our understanding of technology and technological change was very limited. In policy and in academia, technology was treated as a residual factor, some exogenous factor to development, and mainly because you can't quantify technology. You cannot quantify a particular technology, and you cannot quantify the process of technological change. Sorry, the word change is missing in that first bullet point. So the number of economists treated it as a residual factor. It did not matter. You had, there was economic growth or a portion of economic growth that you could not explain using the traditional economic variables such as land, labor, and machinery. The knowledge, the application of knowledge, which as we agreed is technology, could not be accounted for, could not be quantified. And so you come across literature. Just picked one by Nathan Rosenberg, who wrote this book, Inside the Black Box, Technology and Economics, very influential book, and essentially argued that in fact growth and development in general is largely driven by technology. It's not the land, it's not labor, it's not machinery. It's the application of knowledge, the application of science, as we discussed. So over the years, there's been a lot of interest in technology, interest in academia, in policymaking, and the public. If you don't acquire it, you can't develop. But there's also been concern also that in fact development on its own, if not left on its own, has a number of consequences, causing environmental harm, as we'll appreciate. Many of the environmental problems that we have are associated with the unwise development and application of technology. So in the 70s, You had groups such as the Club of Rome that focus on this environmental consequences of technological change or technological development. And the point I want to emphasize here is that technology and technological change do not have this autonomous logic or inbuilt logic to impact positively or negatively on society. It's how you use technology. It's the wise use of technology, and one could go on and emphasize the wise use of science, technology, and innovation. Just some other general points. So in the 80s, 70s and 80s, there was a lot of scholarship on how technology impacts on development. It makes some rich, others poor. Technology and its application or innovation, which is as we agreed, is the introduction, diffusion, and application of technology, can also lead to underdevelopment of some, can lead to social exclusion. And that debate took place in the 70s. Then you got views about appropriate technology, developing technologies that are appropriate to society, that are ecologically sensitive. And then in the 80s and 90s, you started getting concepts such as technology transfer to deal with these inequalities, underdevelopment and overdevelopment in certain parts of the world. This big divide, technological divide, that you needed to transfer technologies from rich economies to the poor economies. So the notion of technology transfer came up, and during these times of COVID, as some of you or most of you are hearing, there is a call for increased transfer of technologies, particularly those that will enable countries to address the pandemic. So issues of intellectual property protection are coming up, but there's also emphasis on countries building their own capabilities to catch up. To be able to receive a new technology, you must have certain capabilities. And so the notions of catch-up, leapfrogging, and capability building are coming to the fore. And then just a point that for Africa, and as we'll discuss, there's a lot to learn. Africa can learn from countries that have, in relatively short periods of time, harnessed science, technology, and innovation to get onto development, to deal with the issues of poverty, to transform their economies. So you'll read about South Asian, East Asian countries. Sorry, it's not South Asian, it's East Asian countries. And there's a lot of literature now on that. South Korea, Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, how those countries in a relatively short period of time, less than 50 years, have been able to transform their economies. South Korea's GDP in the 1960s was actually lower than South Africa's. South Korea had relatively few patents. But today, South Korea's patents are more than three times those held by South Africa. Ghana's GDP was higher than that of Singapore in 1965. But today you can't compare the two economies. There's been an expansion of the economies, and in many ways related social and political liberties in a country such as Singapore. The point I'm emphasizing here is that for Africa, there are actually lessons. If Africa is to harness and deploy science, technology, and innovation for economic change, for development, in general. So just quickly about the UN SDGs. And I recommend that you all look at Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World, which has 7 Sustainable Development Goals, starting from leaving nobody behind, no poverty, to partnerships for sustainable development. So you have 17 goals with 169 targets, and they are different goals, but really interrelated. In the preamble of Agenda 2030, emphasis is about science, technology, and innovation. So governments agree that, in fact, without science, technology, and innovation, they will not be able to achieve the 17 goals. That, in fact, attainment of the 17 goals is largely dependent on how science, technology, and innovation are harnessed and used. SDG 9, which is on resilient infrastructure, inclusive sustainable industrialization and fostering innovation, is very explicit on STI. The other goals, they recognize that, in fact, STI is important, but there is just a goal, an SDG 9, which is dedicated to STI, emphasizing the importance of scientific research, upgrading technological capabilities of industrial sectors, moving from environmentally harmful production systems, mobilizing resources. And it talks about STI policy for that. Just another point I want to stress, that there is now recognition also that to achieve the SDGs, you require evidence, you require science. So a number of studies are being done to demonstrate that, in fact, without science, SDGs will not be attained. And this is science for policy, science to inform good policy making, inform decision making. During these times of COVID, you'll appreciate, and I'm sure you know this, happening all over in most countries. Governments are putting together advisory mechanisms to deal with different aspects of COVID-19. In some countries, you have a high-level scientific advisory bodies. With climate change, we've had that as well. In some developed countries, you have actually almost scientific advisory committees with different aspects of SDGs. But the point here is that science for policy is very crucial to attain sustainable development goals. Let me quickly move to Agenda 2063, which is Africa's Sustainable Development Agenda. I'm not going to say very much about it because we want you to read it. Please download it and read it. I think every African should have a copy of Agenda 2063. It's Africa's sustainable development framework, well aligned with SDGs, was adopted in 2013, just before the SDGs were adopted. So there were major efforts by the African Union and the UN to make sure that Africa's agenda is well aligned with the SDGs. You'll appreciate if you read the history of the African Union, or the political economy of Africa as a whole. It's really the first time that Africa is taking a long-term view of development. In most countries and at the continent, the tendency has been to deal with development around 5 years. So you have 5-year development plans, but that has really changed over the last years. At the African Union, you have a 50 years plan At national level, there have been a similar effort. So you have Vision 2030, Vision 2040, some countries, but there's long-term planning. And this is important because, again, as we stated earlier, science, technology, and innovation are not about short-term. You don't make investments in STI and expect returns immediately. And that's why, in fact, STI policy is complex in making. How do you ensure that, in fact, you invest for the future? So the African Union has taken a long-term approach and explicitly recognized that, in fact, Africa's transformation, Africa's transition to sustainable development, that the attainment of Agenda 2063 is going to happen if the continent mobilizes science, technology, and innovation. And that recognition, by the way, is not just in Agenda 2063 itself, but goes back to the foundation of the Union, of the African Union, the Constitutive Act, the framework, the legal frameworks that create the African Union, that transformed the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, adopted in 2000, has very explicit provisions on STI. And as we'll discuss when we focus on STISA, that in fact STISA is founded on these provisions, particularly Articles 13 and 14 that provide or set the political foundation for STI and mobilizing the Union to increase investments in STI, to establish programs, STI programs to address the continent's problems. Just again, emphasizing what is an Agenda 2063. And unlike the Organization of African Unity, or AU, which focused on political independence, getting African countries out of colonialism and independence, getting countries to be independent, the African Union focused more on economic integration, political integration. So it's really about development as opposed to political independence. It's about transition to inclusive growth and sustainable development. So the vision of Agenda 2063 is all about that. And as when you read the agenda, you will find and recognize very explicit provisions on science, technology. For example, seeking to integrate science, technology, and innovation in education and training, expanding the African knowledge economy through investments in universities, science, technology research, and many other provisions. Out of Agenda 23, and after actually a relatively long process, the African continent has adopted the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which also puts emphasis on STI in provisions on industrialization, technical standards, intellectual property protection. Later on, we'll have, when we talk of implementation of STISA, we'll go back to this agreement and look at how can Africa use this important trade agreement to harness and deploy STI. The point that is made in this slide is that all, if not most, all African regional economic communities have deposited STI considerations in their regional economic treaties. So if you think of COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, there are specific provisions there. on science, technology, and innovation, putting emphasis that, in fact, industrialization and development will not take within the COMESA context. That trade will not just happen if science, technology are not harnessed. And then the other regional economic communities, just given some examples, the East Africa community has, again, the treaty has a very specific STI provisions. Those have led to a very specific protocol. There's an East Africa community STI protocol, which led to the creation of a special STI commission hosted by Rwanda, getting countries in that regional economic community to work together to develop, harness, and apply STI for development. ECOWAS as well, SADC as well. SADC has also STI provisions with the protocol in place, and very strategic programmatic efforts being developed. So the points that I've been making over the last half an hour or so are: one is that STI has moved to the center of development policy, from global to the regional levels in Africa, explicit recognition that science, technology, and innovation really matter. And we can discuss various initiatives at the global level, at the regional levels. You have all kinds of networks to promote science, technology, and innovation. You have all kinds of strategic initiatives. We can discuss some of these. I'll send you some. We'll send to you some literature on this. For example, the creation of the UN Technology Bank as an output of Agenda 2030, bank dedicated to technology. So developing countries can access technological information or scientific information. They have access to information on different technologies for sustainable development. There are a number of many initiatives at the global level. You have a UN high-level advisory mechanism on STI, and most of the UN agencies, UNESCO, UNCTAD, UNEP, WHO, as you know, have very dedicated programs to STI. At the regional level, as we appreciate now, we have STI protocols in some cases, such as the East African community. You have an organization, the Commission, dedicated to the promotion of STI. So let me pause there, and we'll have during our discussions in the webinars an opportunity to go through some of these issues. To really appreciate that, in fact, STI is now the center of development policy, and if you want, politics